inviting me to this presentation. I'm delighted to be here, particularly because it worked out beautifully. The slides were already available from a previous presentation that one of my colleagues had made. The paper has already been published, so it's relatively low pressure environment, but still, nevertheless, I'm happy to be presenting this last paper that I did at FAU prior to my arrival here at St. Thomas. Quick show of hands, how many of you are aware of ERP systems, enterprise resource planning systems? Right. So, for those of you who are not aware of these are, if you think about the evolution of management information systems worldwide, we've sort of gone in circles, complete whole circles, almost like a wheel that's in motion. So back in the mid-80s, we had this dream of having systems that would cover the whole enterprise, the whole business enterprise. And the dream was that HR would be able to plug into it, marketing would be able to plug into it, and finance would be able to plug into it, and strategic planning would be able to plug into it, operational planning would be able to plug into it. And of course, given the vintage of this dream that I just told you about, think about it, in the mid-80s, what do you think happened? Never took off, right? Because we just did not have the hardware computing power to do this. If you think about it, we have more intelligence in our blenders today than the computers that put them on the moon. So it kind of, it faded and it died away. And so what came instead were these ad hoc standalone systems. So you had a sales management system, or HR system. PeopleSoft, was one of the several companies. You had Peachtree for small businesses, Great Plains for mid-sized businesses. So basically,
excuse me, your computer's going to shut down in a second.
I'll take care of that.
as I was talking about the computing power, the lack thereof,
It has a mind.
So it just kind of, we had a bunch of ad hoc systems. And then, as computing power caught up with the universal human dream of having these larger systems, we again, and this is where the cycle itself comes full cycle, except it's moved forward a little bit, we came up with enterprise resource planning systems. So ERP in this paper refers to enterprise resource planning systems. And just like I tell my accounting students, that don't let your eyes glaze over when you hear the term, because there is a story, in them acronyms. And so enterprise resource planning system, if you think about the words, it's trying to tell you something, right? It's meant for the whole enterprise. It allows you to plan your resources, right? And it's a system, right? It's there is a set of inputs, there is a processor, there are a set of outputs, there is a loop, right? So we came up with ERPSs. Now, I have spent a better part of my research career looking at ERPSs, and what we found was that these are very large-scale, very expensive systems. Okay? You're talking installation bases of about anywhere from $35 to $55 million an installed base. So this is not a trivial investment for any company. Even the largest companies want to make sure that there's going to be some expectation of a positive ROI from making these investments. And my colleagues, in the accounting information systems arena were publishing these papers, and they kept saying, we're not finding significant positive gains or ROIs from these investments. And so there was this big, there was almost this underground movement that suggested that ERP systems were not living up to their promise. And so, so this slide basically talks about that. And then there were some very, very highly publicized failures. Back in 1990, I think it was 2002 or something like that, Hershey's, we've all heard of Hershey's, right? Particularly those of us who have a sweet tooth. So Hershey's implemented their ERP system, and this was right before, 2 months before Halloween. So around this time, and the system went berserk. Okay, and that year, Hershey's competition actually gained market share because it wasn't that Hershey's did not produce enough candies, but guess what? Its problem was logistics. Couldn't get it out. They just couldn't get it out. Couldn't hit the marketplace. So ERPs have consequences, and sometimes if you don't do them right, they have disastrous consequences. Okay, so so here are some of the phases that research in the ERP world or arena has been undertaken in. And as I was saying earlier, that most of the research that I have seen in ERP systems has really covered phases 1 and 2. So people have looked into what are the antecedents of success to ERP systems. How do companies go about implementing ERP systems? And guess what? They looked to find returns from ERP systems within a few months to within a year of implementation. And as I was saying earlier, the returns just were not coming through. Okay, so I do some of my best thinking after a couple of bottles of beer. So, so my friend Andreas and I were at an accounting conference, and Andreas invited me to go have dinner with him, and we were chatting about his research, which is also in the same area. And for those of you who are students here, let me tell you, use those social gatherings to brainstorm. Some of your better ideas will come out of those brainstorming sessions. And I said to Andreas, I said, here you have got companies who are making $30 to $40 million investments. And I have to believe that there is some measure of return on investment that we're just not capturing. And hence we're going about saying that it's not there, but we're just failing to capture this. And so we started talking, and I said, think about it. You're putting in a $30 million system. Are we measuring, are we looking for returns too early? And that was sort of the genesis. And this is the third paper in a string of research that Andreas and I have done in this area. There is a Nicolau and Bhattacharya paper in 2006. There is a Nicolau and Bhattacharya paper in 2008. There is a Nicolau and Chow, Nicolau and Bhattacharya paper in 2013. And it's the same Bhattacharya. And lo and behold, we actually came up with some interesting results. Okay, and so this is also a lesson for the students here. I know that we are increasingly interested in undergraduate research, certainly graduate research at St. Thomas University. And this is a good lesson in formulating a space for yourselves. You don't necessarily have to all flock to the same area of research that everybody else is doing. I keep telling my faculty that our key to success at St. Thomas School of Business is we have to have programs that are one standard deviation away from mainstream programs, because we are a niche school and we need to be niche program oriented. My whole life has been spent, my research life has been spent one standard deviation away from mainstream. Everybody was looking at adoption and initial implementation, and guess what Nicolau and I did? We looked at post-implementation, non-standard deviation. Okay, and so that's what this paper is about. Okay, the slides are actually a little bit older than the paper itself. So you'll find that I talked about 4 hypotheses here, but if you've taken a look at the paper, it actually has only 3 hypotheses. Because essentially we looked at what are the factors that lead to IT adoption. Okay, and although it's not there in the paper, because the reason it's not there in the paper is because we already covered that in the Nicolau and Bhattacharya 2006 paper. You know, so when we sent the paper out for review, the reviewer wrote back saying, you are testing a question, these are anonymous reviews, right? So you're testing a research question that has already been asked in a prior paper and asked us to go read this Nicolau and Bhattacharya paper. Of course, the reviewer doesn't know that he was talking to Nicolau and Bhattacharya, you know, so we had to take that first hypothesis out. And let me ask you a question. What kind of companies do you think adopt ERPSs? Highly competitive industry, firms in highly competitive industries, or firms in monopolies? Come. Somebody has to have a thought. Maria, what do you think?
I think competitive.
Okay. Maria thinks it's competitive. Anybody would like to counter Maria? No? All right. Jacoby? No? All right. Well, here's the story. I'm going to give you 2 examples. All right? I'm going to give you the example of, and mind you, this is a little bit older data, 2012 data, but not that old. In 2012, the airline industry earned about $157 billion in revenues. Okay? And guess how much they earned in income per passenger flown in 2012? Take a wild guess. Almost any number is as good as any other number.
5 cents.
5 cents. Floyd, thank you. It wasn't actually a lot higher than that. You know, it was 37 cents.
You were
Okay,
close.
37 cents.
I thought it
So 37 cents to, you know, the 157 billion, you know, per passenger, to the 157 billion dollars in revenues. I'm going to now mention another company to you that you are very familiar with. Google. In 2012, Google earned $50 billion. Okay? And guess, give it to me in percentages, guess how much of those revenues Google retained in profits?
30%.
37. Spoken like a true bean counter.
37.35.
37.35, you know, perfectionist. Actually, both of them are very close, 27%.
How much?
27%.
I guessed it right.
So now, Lisa, tell me which is the more profitable industry?
Services industry.
Well, mind you, this is,
In
Google
the
is not
tech
really
field.
services, it's more
Services
of
in the tech field.
search engine. Search engine, I mean, yeah, search engine's a service, right? I would hazard the opinion that Google is more of a monopoly than almost any other airline that you can think of. Right? If I asked you to rattle off names of airlines, you would very easily rattle off 4 to 5 names. You might slow down after JetBlue or Southwest, but you know, the first few are very, very, very good. How many search engines can you rattle off? 5. Go ahead.
Google, AltaVista, Yahoo.
AltaVista doesn't
Bing,
exist anymore.
Bing and Ask.com.
Which do you think has the highest market share?
Google.
By
By
how
far.
much?
Google.
At least 80%, 90%.
Oh, you mean Google? 68%.
Baidu.
I'm sorry?
Baidu has the largest market.
To which I react, boo. So Maria, we all, I mean, we think that capitalism is synonymous with competition, but it's not. It's the exact opposite of competition. If you think about it, if capitalism is wealth-oriented, it's the monopolies that maximize their profits. Do you know that in 1984, AT&T, as an auditor, what would you expect? You would expect to see people overstating their revenues and understating their expenses, right? Because they want to look good, right? Guess what AT&T did? They understated their revenues and overstated their expenses because they were afraid that the federal government was going to come after them with antitrust suits and tell them that we need to break you up into baby bells because you're making way too much money. How do I know that? I used to pay $4 a minute to call home to India. Now I pay a cent, 1 cent. So what we argued was somewhat counterintuitive, but economically true, that it is the monopolies, the highly successful companies, the ones that dwarfed the others in sales volume and dollars that adopted ERPs. But that's not what this paper is about. That was sort of our starting point. Okay. So then we went on and we said, well, how do managers think about what they're going to do after the ERP adoption? Because think about it. You've just plumbed down $30 to $40 million for an ERP system, right? If it fails, you are still stuck with a $30 to $40 million investment, right? So your discounted cash flow analysis is not going to work. If you think about it, a very static discounted cash flow analysis says, hey, if I were to discount my future cash flows down to my present value, is it positive, is it negative? Based on that, I make a decision. Well, it doesn't work that way with ERP systems because you've already made the investment. And there's no going back. Okay. So we did some literature search, which is another good lesson for our budding researchers here, which is read a lot. Read your literature. There are gold mines to be dug there. And so what we did was we went back and we said, well, let's take a look, to see what do managers do, and how can we actually find a model that reflects what what kind of decision-making managers enter into. Turns out that there is a model out there called a real options lens or a real options model. Okay. Again, just as I said before, don't let your eyes glaze over when you hear the term ERPS. It's trying to tell you something. Real options. There's a storyline there, right? It's telling you that there are paths to management decision making, right? And each path can be evaluated almost independently. And sometimes there are joint paths, but even then, there are discrete paths. So you've made an ERP, and I'll just give you an example. You've made an ERP installation decision. You're going to look for success, right? If success comes early, then given the monopolist nature of the firm, and you're trying to create technical barriers, and you're trying to create academic barriers, and you're trying to create market barriers for competition to come in, right? What are you going to do? You're going to want to make enhancements, right? But who makes enhancements? The companies that have had an early initial success with ERP systems are the ones that are going to think about making the enhancements because it keeps the momentum going, right? If on the other hand, if you're a Hershey and you did a $40 million SAP installation and it didn't go well and you were not able to sell your candies over Halloween, what are you going to do? What's your natural instinct as, because remember, at the end of the day, managers walk on the ground like you and I, right? As a human being, what's your instinct going to be? Pull back, pull back, pull back. You know, we made this investment, it's not going the way we wanted it to go. You're going to hold back, okay? So we said, okay, so that's one factor. The second factor was that we found, Nicolau, my friend and co-author, did a seminal study back in 2004 that was published in the Journal of Information Systems, where he looked at the kind of post-implementation review that is undertaken by companies, and he actually used independent judges to classify them as good post-implementation review, bad post-implementation review, ugly post-implementation reviews. You know, so essentially he came up with sort of a nominal structure of post-implementation reviews. So like I said, you know, this discussion that was being fueled by Bhattacharya, you know, actually better. We said, so we need to look at success timing. We need to look at whether companies engage in post-implementation review. And if they do, what's the quality of the post-implementation review that they engage in? And then 3, we need to look at the timing of the enhancement. Remember, we said, you know, companies are going to want to perpetuate the gains that they have made with the ERP installation, right? So our question was, what is the timing of the next enhancement, and the next one after that, and the next one after that? So to that end, so we talked about the real options and all that. To that end, what we did was, let's just go to the data. Yeah. So we started off with a list of 247 firms that actually we went and looked for ERP announcements. Yeah, and which basically meant Andreas was sitting there and looking, you know, in CompuStat, in the Wall Street Journal, in Barron's to see whether or not there were these firms that were making announcements of ERP, you know, adoptions. So we found 247 of these between 89 and 98. Okay. Then we searched LexisNexis, which is basically a database, for those of you who are not familiar with LexisNexis, it's a database of newspaper announcements. Not just newspaper, but media announcements. For the 10 years following the initial adoption. Because remember, we were looking at post-implementation, right? So it's not enough for us to just get data on the implementation. We need data on post-implementation. And we said, at a minimum, there have to be 3 data points beyond implementation for us to successfully say that we are actually tracking post-implementation. Okay? So, because not everything is available on LexisNexis, not everything is available on CompuStat, we dropped from 247 to 181 adopters. Okay? Between 89 and 98. We matched each adopter firm year with matching control non-adopter firm years. Now you might ask, well, how do you know, Dr. B, as to whether or not a firm was a non-adapter or not? And that's a very valid question because we really don't. You know, what we can say is, we found a definite adopter. And then we looked at companies in the same SIC code, and if you didn't show in LexisNexis, and if you didn't show anywhere else, then we said you are a non-adapter. Now, is there noise in that? Of course there is. You know, maybe in some obscure journal that we totally missed, there was an announcement. But frankly, I doubt it. You know, frankly, I doubt it. Because if you make an ERP announcement, guess what? The only time you make it is if you're expecting it to be successful. And if you're expecting it to be successful, you're not going to keep it under wraps. Okay? All right. So let's see. We can. So here's a little breakout of the samples. So we had 247, like I said, right? Non-adopter firm years, of course, A lot more companies did not adopt than did adopt, so you had 27,457. We lost 66 because of these non-availability of data part that I just mentioned. We were down to 181 firms, 20,168 non-adopters, and then if you multiply 181 by 10, remember we said we collected data over 10 years, so 1810 firm years, of which again we lost 395 for non-availability of data. We were down to 1550. Okay? All right. Now, you know, this is not again in this paper, but one of our earlier papers, we had a reviewer that came back and said, and again very valid, said, look, you're looking at upgrades and enhancements. What about abandonments and failures? So we said, okay, we'll go back and capture abandonments and failures too, because there are abandonments and failures with ERPs. But guess which way the media or the news publications are biased towards? Success. Success. Who wants to, I mean, one of my areas of interest is cybersecurity, right? And you know what the problem is with cybersecurity or lack thereof? Nobody wants to talk about when they were broken into. Chase doesn't want you to think that your money is not safe with them. P.F. Chang's doesn't want you to stop dining with them and, and stop ordering American chop suey or whatever it is that you're ordering from them. Right? They have a vested interest in not talking about their failures. Right? So guess what? Data constraint. We were not able, we found 27 stories of failures. Just not enough data. So we wrote back to the reviewer saying, great point, sorry, we don't have the data. And I'll tell you, it's much better to be upfront with the reviewer and tell the reviewer what you can or cannot do instead of trying to fudge data, which I personally have seen happening, and you should not want to do that. Okay, very good. So remember I told you about how my friend Nicolau back in 2004 divided up the PIRs into high quality, medium quality, poor quality PIRs. So the 3 high quality post-implementation reviews were, do they undertake any project planning? Do they undertake any strategy definition, post-implementation? Do they undertake any process integration? Remember we talked about ERP systems are really a lot about process integration. So those are the 3 PIRs that we sort of captured as high quality back from 2004. Another lesson here. Remember I talked about reading up prior literature? Because you'll find people have already done things. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you do have to read about them so that you know you're not reinventing the wheel, right? So go back and read prior literature so that you know what has already been done, so that you are not trying to spin you, because nobody's going to publish what has already been done just because you're the one reading it again. So it's important to be familiar with prior literature in a given area. All right. So again, this particular hypothesis or model was captured in our 2008 paper. It's not part of this paper, but I didn't want to leave it in here because it answered the question that I asked Maria earlier, which she gave a very good answer to, but was incorrect. No, I'm just picking on you. That we found that ERS adoption is really a function of industry competitiveness and market power, right? And guess what we found? That there is an inverse relationship between competitiveness and ERP installation and market, and there's a positive correlation between market power, and ERP installation, which suggests what? Monopoly, or monopolistic directions at least, right? All right. And I know you've all read the paper. And so therefore I'm not going to dwell too much on this Herfindahl's index and token skew and all that. If you want to talk about those things, come see me, and I'll be more than happy to spend a day and a half discussing these with you. All right. But this stage 2, what you're looking at as stage 2, is really the main approach to this paper, which is, remember we talked about ERP enhancements? Right? And what? So this paper is really about what are the antecedents to companies making enhancements to their installation of ERP systems. Okay. And essentially, we found, I'm going to start wrapping up now because I do want to leave some time for us to ask questions and answers. What we found was, yeah, this is great. So, see the H1A in that model? H1A says that ERP adoption is a function of competitive advantage, right? Competitive advantage as measured by what? As measured by market share and competitiveness in the industry, okay? So Herfindahl index is a good index of competition in the industry, and token skew is a good surrogate for market share. And indeed, our results bore this out, except that the reviewer came back and said, we're not interested in this. These people, Nicolau and Bhattacharya, have already done this. Go read their paper. And we, being Nicolau and Bhattacharya, unbeknownst to the reviewer, said, ah, yes. So we took it off, this paper, okay? So what you're seeing as H2, H3, and H4 here are really our H1, H2, and H3, okay? So we said that the probability of future enhancement in H2, which is hypothesis 2, we said that the probability of future enhancement is a function of performance after adoption. If you've done well after adoption, you'll want to perpetuate that success, you know, and so you're going to want to enhance the ERP system. We also said that the probability of future enhancement is also a function of not only whether or not you undertake post-implementation review, but the quality of the post-implementation review. So, because we looked at PIR, been broken up into high quality, medium quality, low quality PIRs, and we said it's a function of the quality of the post-implementation. The third hypothesis said that that enhancement is a function of time. Remember, I started my talk today by saying that we felt that people were looking for success too early in the process, right? And guess what? We found that most ERP systems installations, actually performance, if you measure performance as using return on assets or something similar to that, actually dips significantly in the year of adoption and even in the year following the adoption, and then it begins to, so it almost, you know, there's a valley, and then you begin to climb out of that valley, and really your long-term aim is, once you start climbing out of that valley, then you will be able to carry on that trajectory. Okay? So those were our three hypotheses. Okay? And I can go through some of these numbers just to show you that I do know something about these numbers. So the decision to adopt ERPS, we said, was a function of competitiveness and market share, right? Look at the number of stars next to market share, firm size, profitability, the free cash flow, the cash flow from operations, the risk variable, right? And the one that I'll share with you that I was not particularly thrilled to get was the Herfindahl index, which was market competitiveness. it does come out somewhat significant, but not as strong as the other variables. Okay, and then of course, we being data crunching encounters, we started playing with the variables. So we came up with four models of adoption, and we started leaving out certain variables and putting in other variables to see whether or not we could improve upon the R squared of the regression equation. Okay, and this was just purely, this is just sort of intellectual playfulness. Why did we do it? Because we couldn't. So, all right. So then, here is the raison d'etre of this paper, which is the decision on post-implementation system adoptions. And I want to point out to you, look at the initial performance variable. Both on the t-test and the Wilcoxon rank sum test, notice that the significance is at 0.001. So, so it's a strong variable. Same thing with whether or not they undertook post-implementation review, right? The PIR, if you look at it, it's 0.01. Sales is at 0.01, right? Which begins to suggest what? That the competitiveness, the lower the competition, the higher the market share, the higher the probability of not only initial adoption, but enhancement after that. Okay. And again, over here we did two models. One was just looking whether or not what drives companies' decision to enhance their ERP systems, which is model 1. And then we looked for an interaction between whether companies undertake post-implementation review and their enhancement timing. And we found that most successful ERP installations, they enhance in the medium time frame, which is 3 to 5 years after the initial implementation. It takes them that long before they start putting in the enhancements. So, what did we do? Did we just empirically prove that 2 plus 2 makes 4? No. What we did was that we showed that, one, studies that had found lack of significant performance enhancements following ERP investments were probably looking to find that data too early in the process. That ERP systems being large, enterprise-wide systems, the time frame has to be taken out, not just the year of adoption or even the year after adoption, but some people will tell you 5 to 7 years out. Okay. 2, we found that whether or not companies continue to evolve their ERP systems is a function of how well they've done with the initial ERP investment. If they've done well, then they will move on to enhance and really make their grip on their monopoly position stronger, or at least attempt to. Okay? It also is a function of whether or not companies undertake post-implementation review and what the quality of that post-implementation review is. If they undertake high-quality post-implementation review, it actually will garner better return on assets and other financial measures for them. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, where we go from here is Andreas and Gian and I have been talking about whether or not we can take this to see whether or not the enhancements by themselves can be tracked to future enhancements. Okay? Because remember, we said real options models. So you come to decision junctures, right? Which allow you to do what? To say, will I take the next step or will I not take the next step? Okay? So we want to pursue this a little bit further to see how long we can actually trace this cycle. But in order to do that, we're going to have to go out there and collect more data. Okay? And which, right now, I'm telling Andreas that he has the research assistants and the time, therefore he should get his TA to do it, or his RA to do it. Andreas is telling Gian, and Gian is telling me, so we're in that, you know. So just like the ERP systems that we research, we are making a real options decision-making process, and right now we're not ready to make any enhancements, you know. And so it'll be a question of time before we get started on that. Well, thank you very much, and you know, I'm open to questions.
The first one is what happened with Hershey's after the Halloween logistics massacre?
Great question. Well, they fixed their ERP system, you know, which is, you know, if you think about it, if it was just a, you know, $10,000, $100,000 installment, what do? Maybe you fire your CIO, you know, you say, well, this was a bad decision, you know, and then we're going to go with something else. You don't have that option. You've gone down $30, $40 million, you know, on this installation. It has to work, you know. So what happened to Hershey's was, it was a very rude awakening. I think there was a lot of hubris involved. Why would you be a candy company and roll out a SAP, I forget whether it was an SAP or an Oracle installation, but whatever it was, why would you roll out an enterprise resource planning system, you know, in July and August, knowing that you've got the biggest sales for your company are coming in late October? But it was an interesting lesson for them.
And the follow-up is, do you believe it's part of the problem is it's just the too early adoption of technology wasn't ready to deploy at those large sizes? I mean, if they deploy now, let's say 2014, are they better right off the gate?
I think it's a terrific question that I don't have a good answer to. One, is technology better today? Absolutely. Do we have more experience today? Absolutely. You know, and so those are good interactions to have. You know, I mean, by interaction I mean interaction effect. You know, technology is smoother, the code is better, it's more robust, computing power is greater. Our experience with ERP systems is way more now than, you know, back then. But on the market, there were successful implementations even back then. You know, they just didn't do it right the first time. And PwC was actually their consultant, and PwC lost a lot of money on it.
Now, is any difference between the implementation of SAP and Oracle, or the failures or successes are more?
I think that's a terrific question, Jose, that I don't have the answer to, because we looked at ERP installations and we did not really parse between PeopleSoft or SAP, or now PeopleSoft is part of Oracle. You know, but I think that's a terrific question that should be empirically examined, that we have not done. Anything else? Now remember, there's going to be a quiz. Well, thank you very much.